Hello everybody and welcome to Marxism Festival 2021 online, and welcome to this meeting on global catastrophe and the rise of the far right. I'm Ruby and I'm going to be chairing this session. We've got three fantastic speakers on the panel for you today, and I'm going to introduce them in order as they're about to speak. So the first speaker we've got today, I'm really pleased to welcome Paul Mason. He's a well-known journalist and author, and he's also got a book coming up on how to stop fascism. So we're all really excited for that. Thank you. Over to you, Paul.
I'm unmuted. Thank you. Hello everybody, and thanks for inviting me. And hi to Alex and Christina, who I'm looking forward to discussing with on this, and to people who want to ask questions. So I've written a book called How to Stop Fascism: History, Ideology, Resistance. I'll talk a bit about it, but it's not out yet. If anybody feels like ordering it, it'd be great. I want to start with a quote from the French neo-fascist Maurice Bardèche, writing in the early 60s when most fascists were a bit despondent, apart from the odd sort of French underground OAS member. Bardèche predicted as follows, it's quite poetic: with another name, another face, and with nothing which betrays the projection from the past, with the form of a child we do not recognize and the head of a young Medusa, the order of Sparta will be reborn. That was a far-sighted project, a far-sighted thing to say, in fact, for what we call a neo-fascist, because what Bardèche was really saying was that forget the hangovers of Nazism, Mussolini fascism, even Francoism, which was at the time, if you remember, a regime. He's saying the fascism that will replace Nazism and Mussolinism will be reborn in a way that we, the fascists, probably won't recognize, or there'll be aspects of it that we would find very weird. And I think that, in very short, is what's happening. What's happening is that forces we will come to describe have not basically inherited the fascist tradition, although they've inherited many aspects of it. They're no longer, as it were, a tribute band for Hitlerism and Mussolini and Franco. What we're seeing is like, to use a gardening term, fascism regrown from its philosophical roots. If you've read about fascism, we could talk about this, the philosophical roots of it in pre-1914 irrationalism. Well, pre-1914 irrationalism never went away. In fact, it's flourished in Western thought. Friedrich Nietzsche, Spengler, and the rest, we can talk about them. Scientific racism. What's happening is a whole new generation has taken these philosophical roots of fascism and grown something new from them. Now, just for the last 12 months, you could list some of the things that they've been doing. The Capitol Hill riot, which Alex has written about in that IS article, the Bolivian coup, Bolsonaro's movement and its fascist and militaristic grassroots, the Sangh Parivar in India, which is off the leash, sort of staging pogroms against Muslims, beating students with iron bars all over the place. We've now got the prospect of Le Pen making a serious run in France next year for the presidency. And I'm sure Christina will talk about that AfD in Germany. Its Flügel wing, which has been shut down, was veered so violently towards in a way that it's completely counterintuitive. You'd think they'd want to keep a lid on it, but no, they got themselves so badly in trouble with the German anti-fascist legal authorities that they had to sort of be restrained. We've got the prepper groups in Germany and elsewhere. We've got the FPÖ in Austria. We've got generation identity everywhere. And of course, we could spend the entire afternoon talking about the nut jobs of British fascism. But for me, the danger doesn't simply lie in this bestiary of far-right and alt-right groups, interesting though they are. The Proud Boys and the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers, who basically staged the violent part of the Capitol Hill rising. We should study them. We should fear them, actually. But but they aren't the main problem. For me, the main problem is there is a new thought architecture, a new structure to the ideology of fascism, and it's now proliferating spontaneously, and it's colonizing its precursor ideologies. If you think about the precursor ideologies, are the ideology of the Tea Party movement, the ideology of the old militia movement, or white supremacy in America, the ideology of the Lega, which we call the Lega Nord in Italy, now called Lega. What you're seeing is this new thought architecture. I use the terminology backfill. It's backfilling existing prejudices, so that 10 years ago, you met somebody who was basically a sort of BNP voter or an early UKIP voter. They would say, I don't like immigrants, they're taking on jobs, some of this stuff, feminism's gone too far. Now, when you meet the same people, they say, when's the Civil War starting? Or you're a cultural Marxist, or any of the things that I'll talk about it in detail if we've got time. All the aspects of fascist thought are there in the minds of people just in Wetherspoons in small town England. You come across it. Masks are Marxism. This is the COVID, anti-COVID masks are a Marxist plot. I don't think I ever came across that in all the years as an anti-fascist and anti-racist. It was very rare to come across systemically philosophical fascism in the minds of relatively uneducated people. But that's what we're now seeing. No. One of the big what is worth saying about this ideology before we think about it in detail, that here's another problem we have with Hitlerism. So Hitler was in charge, he was the gatekeeper. There's Mein Kampf, various editions, and if you wanted, like the green fascist movement of the 1920s, if you wanted to add sort of green fascism and Nordic mysticism to Hitlerism, well, Hitler kind of was in charge of grafting it on, or of that Alfred Rosenberg, the fascist philosopher, he never had ownership of the fascist ideological credo. But today, the fascists co-create it. So there is no central author. And so it can morph. And you saw this with QAnon, and the way QAnon has grafted itself on to all forms of proto-fascist thinking, like the Querdenker in Germany, like the Tea Party, like the anti-mask movement here. So we're dealing not just with something that is new and proliferating, it's also changing faster than we are used to seeing change in the history of fascism. So to me, here's one of the biggest political challenges. Political science has spent nearly 30 years constructing definitions, based on the old Weberian sociology ideal model, ideal type definition of here's fascism, here's right-wing populism, here's conservatism. And we're all used to that. Marxism does its own version of that. Marxists have to be interested in it in historical terms, in the difference between, say, the Nazi Party and the DNVP, the right-wing populist party that it took a lot of votes from. We are interested in that. The problem is that political science told us that these new right-wing populist movements, so UKIP, the Lega Nord in Italy, even you could classify the Front National, and the Rassemblement as a right-wing populist movement. We're supposed to see these as a firewall against fascism. So if somebody goes on a UKIP mobilization or a Brexit Party mobilization, at least they're not fascists. I've been even told by Hope Not Hate, not to call the Democratic Football Lads Alliance a fascist group, because they're not. They see themselves as slightly different from fascism. Now, here's my take on this. The firewall is on fire. The firewall of right-wing populism is being progressively colonized and combusted by actual fascism. It's not a protection at all. It's turned into a transmitter for it. And there's no greater example than that than Trump. And not only the Trump movement, so we think about, Stop the Steal, which was an official organization sponsored by Trump, or, for example, the Trump campaign or the Tea Party movement. These are quite clearly now vectors for the new fascism. But lo and behold, the Republican Party, the oldest democratic Republican party almost in the world, Abraham Lincoln's party, is a willing vector for fascism. This is the problem. This to me is the biggest problem. And again, however much you look at the history of Nazism, you see in 1932, all the bigwigs of German industry get together, forming the Harzburg Front, the National Front, to fight for a nationalistic, anti-democratic Germany. Hitler stood apart from it. And they stood apart from him because they said, well, you can be a part of this, you can do our bidding, but we're the big cheeses. Hitler, of course, turned the tables on them. But we're facing something different. We're facing now these same forces.
5 minutes left, Paul.
Got it, thanks, Ruby. We're facing them being willing vectors for fascism. Right. Now, what do we do? I mean, the thought architecture itself, we could talk about it in great detail, but its central aspect is the Great Replacement theory. The idea that immigration is a form of genocide against white people and that it's being organized, feminists depress the birth rate, migrants genocide white people, cultural Marxism, i.e. the left and social liberalism, promotes it all. And then in the extreme version, Jews are behind, George Soros and the Rothschilds are organizing it. That is the center of the new fascism, that liberalism and democracy are the main enemy, that cultural Marxism is a plot. The poor old Frankfurt School has ended up taking the blame for all this. Their strategy is what they call metapolitics. That is, they're not seeking to strut around and intimidate people all the time, as they were, say, with the NF in the days of the ANL. They're far more clearly in a wait-and-see game. They expect Western society to collapse. And here's the final part of their ideology, Day X. So metapolitics is about preparing for Day X. Day X is when the international ethnic civil war kicks off. And that's fascism. Now, the challenge for Marxism, I think, is no Marxist predicted the original fascism. I think Marxism coped very badly theoretically with it. Gramsci, the early Italian Communist Party, the early KPD, the Comintern struggled to understand what they were seeing. When they finally got their heads around, it wasn't just a kind of guard dog of the bourgeoisie. They got as far as it's relatively autonomous from the bourgeoisie. And it's not just the Black Hundreds, in other words. Gramsci, for me, gives the key to where we need to go with this debate. In 1921, shocked by the Squadristi campaign, Gramsci said, fascism is out of control. He said, it's only partially a class phenomenon. To me, this is the most revolutionary thing a Marxist has ever said about fascism. It's only partially to do with class. So if it's only partially class, what's the rest of it? And for me, and much of my book and my writing is about this, the rest of it, the Marxist version of how to explain the rest of it, comes in the writings of the psychiatrists and psychoanalysts of the 30s, Erich Fromm and the slightly nutty but incredibly brave Wilhelm Reich. Because they said, what we're dealing with here is not just class despair of the middle classes. We're dealing with something more deeply human that is part of all class societies, to do with what we would now call power, patriarchy, oppression. Finally, in 1 minute, what to do? One, anti-fascism is obligatory. We have to be all anti-fascist now. And it's all right saying it among a Marxist, fantastic 500 people online for a Marxist seminar on fascism. Great. But it's what we need to say in the Labour Party, in the trade unions, among liberals, to the Guardian. Either you're anti-fascist or you're preparing the moment when someone puts you into a concrete box and gasses you. That's what we need to be saying to them. Two, here's where we'll probably have a discussion. There's only 2 times in the 30s that anti-fascists actually strategically succeeded. And they were electoral pacts that stopped this alliance of right-wing populists and fascists from winning elections. And they were in the Spanish general election, early 1936, and then the French general election of April, May 1936. Both those victories were produced by overt alliances of the left and the centre. Now, the Popular Fronts weren't just top-level alliances, they were mass movements. They were mass cultural movements where the memberships of organisations mixed in base-level committees. I think we have to revive something like that. Just even in terms of defeating Trump, that's what the American left had to do. Finally, and here I'll be really interested to see how this plays with Christina, and obviously it will bond with some of you comrades. I think there is a place for demanding state repression. And I know how difficult this is for leftists, because the argument is always, well, they're going to use the state repression against us. But Karl Lowenstein, the German-American philosopher who had a great influence on the German basic law after 1945, insisted that in places where the Popular Front can't work or isn't enough, you're going to have to repress them.
Now, please.
You're going to have to repress them. And so, you know, how you do that, of course, is difficult. It's challenging. But I do think that is the third element of it. I think repressing the people, if the state had not repressed the people who invaded the capital, then 6th of January would have ended in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We've decided to extend the meeting slightly to 5:30 because we think there's going to be so much interesting discussion, and there has been throughout the day, and we really want to just give time for people to make contributions and ask questions. So each of our speakers is speaking for 15 minutes, and after the panel discussion, there's going to be time for discussion from the floor. So if you have got comments you want to make and questions, stick your hand up. While the discussion's going on, you can already start getting your hands up if you do want to speak. So now I'm able to introduce our second speaker. Christine Schultz is a member of parliament in Germany for Die Linke, and she's been centrally involved in campaigns against the far-right AfD. So thank you so much, Christine.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Alex, for joining me on this panel. Today is the 8th of May, the day of liberation from fascism, which is among left-wingers celebrated in Germany. The AfD talks about an absolute defeat and about a loss of design options, like social design options in the context of the 8th of May, the defeat of German fascism. And I think this brings me directly into our topic. I would like to bring in my experience from anti-fascist struggle in Germany into the debate, and to share our impressions, to share our experience. The pandemic has arisen at a time when we have experienced political polarization in Germany, long before. At the same time, the level of class struggle is quite low, although the consequences of neoliberal attacks of Agenda 2010 under the right-wing government of the ex-Chancellor Gerhard Schröder has led to an expansion of low-wage sector, privatization, and a solidification of poverty in society. The semi-fascist AfD, so it's not a fascist party so far, but has a very strong fascist current inside, uses its presence in all parliaments in Germany to agitate against Muslims and migrants. And in this climate, attacks on migrants, leftists, trade unions and others are on the rise. The sad climax was the assassination of Walter Lübcke, a conservative politician who advocated the acceptance of refugees. The murder was an active supporter of the AfD. And there was the attack on the synagogue in Halle, in which 2 people died. And of course, the murder of 9 people by a racist in Hanau, a racist that was driven by the idea of great replacement Paul talked about. So the AfD is the political arm of right-wing terror in Germany, and this is why we are constantly fighting it and mobilizing against it. The AfD is kind of a rallying point for fascist, right-wing nationalists that originally came from the right wing of the conservative CDU party, and it currently connects with the Querdenken, the Corona denier protests, and with right-wing networks in society, but also especially in the army, in security agencies, and so on. At the same time, and I think this is important to understand, a conflict has been simmering in the AfD since the beginning. So the fascist wing, which has officially been disbanded, but whose protagonists still drive the AfD, aim to abolish democracy and build a fascist movement party. The National Conservative wing is no less racist or nationalist, but it wants to seize power through a coalition government with the conservative CDU. So both wings are still dependent on each other at the moment, and the driving force is the fascist wing. There was a party conference of the AfD because we have general election in September. So all the parties are preparing for this. There was a party conference in Dresden in the beginning of April, and the AfD adopted a through reactionary election program, so which is not new, but so they had a lot of arguments about special issues, and on a number of important issues, Björn Höcke, the fascist wing's leader, has been able to assert itself. The program is a Völkisch nationalist because it calls for the restoration of an ethnically cleansed German people. It is sexist because it calls on German women to spend more of their lives with children than at work. It is racist because it warns against the children of migrants of Arab and Turkish origin because they are supposedly less intelligent than German children, or what the AfD calls German children. And for the first time in post-war German history, I think there's a danger of the re-emergence of a fascist party with a mass influence nationwide. So this is the one side. Nevertheless, the AfD has declined slightly in the last elections, and it has also weakened significantly in the polls compared to the peak phase 3 years ago. So there was a constant rising of the polls over 5-6 years, and there was a peak 3 years ago. And this turning point, which didn't lead to a defeat of the AfD, but which turned the tide in a way, was due to anti-fascist and anti-racist mass mobilizations in the recent years. I think the most prominent was the 250,000 people marching in Berlin in October 2018. But there have been countless mobilization by local alliances in many cities over the years, either directly confronting the AfD or mobilizing in support of refugees, the Black Lives Matter movement, and against racism, and for example also after the killings in Hanau. On May Day, the AfD tried to present itself as a workers' party in several places, and for example in Potsdam near Berlin, an anti-fascist alliance managed to get more people on the streets than the AfD, although the trade union in this specific case was not very helpful with the protest in many places. So we are able to involve the trade unions, and they are very helpful in the protest, which is very important. I think it's important to see that the activity of anti-fascists in many places are key to create mood in society and to create a pressure to push back the AfD. Even the police union, not a haven for progress, has issued an incompatibility resolution with the AfD. I think this is this is an indicator for I think for this movement, isolating the AfD. So the resistance on the streets has at least slowed down the rise of the AfD, and it's driving up the price of the AfD's possible participation in a government. For the AfD, the next goal is to win the elections in Saxony-Anhalt. This is a federal state in the east of Germany, and the election will be in June. In the conservative camp, there are forces in favor of a cooperation with the AfD. And these forces are especially strong in Eastern Germany, not so much in the West, but there. And they have made the former head of the domestic intelligence service, Hans-Georg Maaßen, a candidate for the CDU in a constituency in Thuringia. Hans-Georg Maaßen is known. He was fired after he denied in October 2018 that migrants had been chased in Chemnitz. In Chemnitz, there had been pogroms against migrant people after a man presumably was stabbed by refugee, and there had been over 2 3 days mass pogroms of Nazis and right wingers against migrants, and this guy denied that this happened, and Maaßen was fired then, and afterwards he has repeatedly campaigned for an alliance between the AfD and the CDU. So this is one pole in the conservative camp. The other pole in the conservative camp is marked by the Bavarian Prime Minister Markus Söder. In 2018, he had, during the election campaign in Bavaria, declared that he wanted to stop asylum tourism, quote, in Germany. And with this, he tried at that time to fish the votes in the AfD environment. And Söder, and then afterwards the CSU, so the conservative in Bavaria, they lost 10% of the vote. Today he says that this was a mistake. He says he regrets his statement. It was a serious mistake in the fight against the AfD because you can't win voters by adopting the populist slogans. And I think it is interesting that you have these two poles in the conservative camp. But what is our conclusion? I think it's important to see the difference, but to know that we cannot rely on the conservative. I think it's key to have a broad anti-racist and anti-fascist mass movements, which actually also exists in the election in Bavaria, and which had been strong over the last years in Germany. And this is decisive to pressure even on conservative politicians. At the moment, the conservatives are sinking in the polls. The Greens are the strongest party for the first time in the polls. And I think there's a danger that they will play the racist cards. For example, the conservatives just have passed a motion against political Islamism, or what they call political Islamism. And also they just passed a law in the German Bundestag, which was initially intended to ban Nazi tattoos on civil servants, but in the same law that bans Nazi tattoos on civil servants, it bans religious symbols, which is, as we know in practice, a law that is directed against women wearing the hijab. So this law, the Die Linke was the only party in the Bundestag voting against this this law, and I think this gives us an idea that racism still is very strong, and you can't rely that we can't rely that they don't take on racism in this election campaign. I think the struggle against racism in all its form must be closely linked to the struggle against fascism. And so we need the broadest possible unity in the struggle against fascism, determined to stop the fascists. So this includes all that wants to join us. And we want those affected by racism to play an important role in these struggles. And we want trade unions to be an active part of this anti-fascist protests. At the same time, a consistent struggle against racism is so important, and this concerns racism in all its dimensions. Anti-Semitism that spreads with the conspiracy theories in society at the moment. The racism directed against migrants and refugees in general. The anti-Roma racism, which is one of the highest forms of the highest level of racism in society. The same with the anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, the common denominator of the extreme right and its main mobilization theme in broader society. And especially against the last two forms of racism, there are no strong firewalls in society. So that is what we have to work against and have to fight against. Therefore, I think it's important task for us as left in the current situation to support the protest against the danger of the rise of fascism in the upcoming election campaign. We think that the matter of fact that our domestic secret service is now at least controlling parts of the AfD is an effect of our protest and mobilization. It's not the solution to fight the fascists, I think, but I think we have to discuss, we can discuss on this later on. I think it's key to build these strong movements, and as fascists build on despair, it is important to develop a strong anti-capitalist answer that orientates on class struggle and the struggle against oppression instead of racism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christine. Brilliant to hear from you. Before I introduce the last speaker on the panel, I'd just like to encourage people while the last speaker is talking, you can raise your virtual hand, or maybe you've never spoken in a meeting on Zoom. This is a welcoming atmosphere, and every contribution is welcome. Hopefully we'll fit in as many as we can. So our last speaker is Alex Callinicos. He's a leading member of the Socialist Workers Party, an author, and he's recently written an article in the International Socialist Journal on global catastrophe and the far right. So thank you, Alex.
Thanks a lot. And thanks to everyone who's here, especially to Christina and to Paul. It's been great to be able to have this discussion with, I think, what is a shared sense of urgency, one that's common to all the speakers. And I have to say, I admire a lot of what Paul has been writing about fascism, and I'm looking forward to his book. So this is a discussion within the framework of those who understand the urgency and importance of the struggle against fascism and the far right today. In terms of the kind of assessment of the situation, I agreed very substantially with what both Paul and Christina said. And I think the point that Paul made, that what is the kind of mainly visible aspect of the far right today, which are the populist racist parties, I agree with him completely that they're not a firewall against the real fascists. I think the kind of interplay between what the liberal historian Tim Snyder called the gamers and the breakers in the Republican Party, in other words, on the one hand, people like Mitch McConnell who are happy to use Trump, but remain part of the mainstream establishment. They're the gamers and the breakers, the real hard right characters, either by conviction or out of opportunism, people like Trump himself, Ted Cruz and so on. That interplay and struggle between them, I think, can create the space in which a real American fascism emerges. So I think the situation is an extremely serious one indeed. It's no joke to fascism emerging as a real force in what is still the most powerful capitalist state in the world. It's no joke for Marine Le Pen, a fascist who wears populist, racist clothes, could win the presidential election next year in France, still one of the most powerful states in the world. I would make three qualifications to Paul's overall analysis. First of all, I think it's important to emphasize the role of Islamophobia. This, I think, is the most important stigmatizing ideology that the fascists have today, and it provides much of the cement between them and the broader far right. I think the fascists and the broader far right. I think it's also something that links them up with the centers of capitalist power, because Islamophobia developed in the context of the efforts by Western imperialism to re-establishment their domination of the greater Middle East. So that's one. I think they're all the kind of elements to the mix that Paul talked about, but I think this is one that was missing. Secondly, it's a global phenomenon. This isn't a disagreement, I think, but it's a global phenomenon. Look at India. Here we see the fusion of what John Bellamy Foster and his colleagues call catastrophe capitalism, with the pandemic showing the destructive potential of capitalism's destruction of nature, with a far-right government that is fascist at its core. I mean, Modi, the Prime Minister, is a member of the RSS, a fascist organization created back in the 1920s. So this isn't just a Western phenomenon. Thirdly, well, I don't think there's a huge disagreement about the substance of Paul's analysis of fascism. I think he's wrong simply to dismiss what the Marxist tradition says about fascism, particularly Trotsky. Trotsky got fascism. He got it as a mass movement of the despairing middle classes that, unified by a pseudo-revolutionary, reactionary utopian ideology that could, in certain conditions, converge with the ruling class, converge with big capital and the generals to smash the organized working class. I mean, Trotsky didn't get fascism completely right, precisely because of the radicalism of the Nazis and the fascists. He thought that they couldn't last in power and they'd be replaced by a more conventional kind of dictatorial regime, a military dictatorship. He underestimated the fascists. Hitler murdered his generals, not his generals Hitler. But so what Trotsky said wasn't perfect, but it grasped the dynamics of fascism in a very profound way. But the real disagreements, as Paul hinted, are over what our solutions are. And I just want to, I mean, Paul expressed his view very clearly and eloquently, but I just want to focus on what seemed to me the two key elements, which he was very clear and honest about. First, as he put it in his, I think it was his first response to the 6th of January, the assault on the Capitol, it's necessary to strengthen the power of the state. Where fascism fails, it is because the police do their job and the masses stand ready to do it if they fail. Now, I think let's pause and think about that for a minute. We'll soon be marking the first anniversary of George Floyd's murder by the Minnesota police. Now, that unleashed a movement that Noam Chomsky has called the greatest in American history. What was one of its main slogans? Defund the police. In other words, they were targeting the police. Now, the logic of Paul's position is that we shouldn't be saying that. We should be saying strengthen the police. That makes no sense to me. The police aren't weak. I mean, Obama poured money into the police and made it easier for them to buy the most vicious militarized weapon systems, armored personnel carriers, you know, all sorts of vicious weapon systems and things like that. The police aren't weak, and the British police aren't weak either. Let's not have any illusions about that either. The problem with the police is that they're a deeply racist formation that often have been penetrated by the far right. Look at the struggle against Golden Dawn in Greece and the way in which that involved a struggle against the police. And of course, they operate in the interests of capital and defending the existing order. It beggars belief that we can rely on the police in these circumstances. Secondly, and Paul expressed this very, very clearly, we should repeat the Popular Front of the 1930s. He puts it very clearly in one of his responses to the 6th of January. The lessons of Europe in the 1930s are that the only thing that beats an alliance of the elite and the mob, that fascism, is a temporary alliance of the centre and the left. But if we look at the experience of the Popular Front, we see that what it involved was an alliance between the organised working class, its main parties, the communist and socialist parties in both France and Spain, which are the most important cases, and the liberal bourgeoisie. Now, in the case that Paul talks about a lot, case of France, the liberal bourgeoisie were the dominant section of the ruling class in France. And their party, the radicals, were the dominant party in the French Third Republic. So what the Popular Front in France represented was an alliance between the workers' parties, the communists and socialists, and the core of the establishment, the capitalist establishment in France. What that meant was that the Popular Front, inasmuch as it expressed, as Paul quite rightly says, a rising workers' movement, working class unity was forced on the communist and socialist parties from below after the right-wing attack on the French Parliament on the 6th of February 1934. What the alliance with the radicals did was to halter that movement, so that when the Popular Front won the elections in May and June 1936, there was then a wave of mass strikes and factory occupations, one of the great moments in international working class history, which was brought back to work, especially actually by the Communist Party. Maurice Thorez, the leader of the Communist Party, famously said, one has to know when to call off a strike. That context of demoralization that created led to the fall of the Popular Front, to its replacement by a government under the radical leader Daladier, who ironically had been brought down in the 6th of February 1934, who used repressive measures against the working class and the left and crushed a general strike. The Popular Front Parliament in June 1940 voted to inaugurate the Vichy regime after the success of the Nazi blitzkrieg. That's the actual record of the Popular Front. Now, today, what a Popular Front means allying with the neoliberal establishment, what Tariq Ali called the extreme centre, against the far right. But these are the political forces that represent the core of the neoliberal ruling class, the big banks, the transnational corporations. In other words, the very forces that have led to the process of neoliberal globalization in the first place. I think it's common ground that the far right have benefited from the backlash against neoliberal globalization. To ally with these kinds of forces, the likes of Hillary Clinton, for example, who the other day is calling for taking back the means of production from China, in other words, advocating an explicitly imperialist foreign policy, would be to make it copper-bottomed for the far right to say that they're the only real anti-system force. I mean, think about the situation in Britain, where we have a Tory party, the oldest conservative party in the world, able under Johnson to present itself as an anti-system party. That's one fundamental reason why Labour is in such a mess at the present time. To ally with the extreme centre would essentially to concede the ground of opposition to the system to the fascists. I could say more, but I need to move towards a conclusion by talking about how we would defeat the fascists. And that crucially means politically an alliance of revolutionary and reformist forces to unite as far as possible the entire working class movement and progressive forces against the fascists. And to, on the basis of that alliance, which we see to some extent in Stand Up to Racism with the involvement of the Labour Party and the TUC, alongside, for example, the Socialist Workers Party, people further to the left. Given that we see that's a step in the right direction, but then we need mass mobilization to stop the fascists. Paul says the left is too weak to replace the police and the army in fighting the fascists. But as I said, we can't rely on the police and the army, but it's foolish to think, of course, it's foolish to think we can replace them now. That's not the issue. We can't rely on them to fight the fascists. We have to mobilize a mass movement that can drive the fascists off the streets and marginalize them. This is really the proudest moments in the history of the radical and revolutionary left in this country have included major mobilizations against the fascists. Cable Street in October 1936, the Lewisham demonstration of August 1977, the anti-Nazi League. We need to build on those experiences to develop a very powerful movement. Now, one reason why people are skeptical about this is because of the extent to which the working class has been weakened by neoliberalism, but its organized core still remains very strong. The problem is that it's not mobilized by the trade union leaders and the leaders of the Labour Party and their counterparts in other countries. But we're now operating in a context where there are new movements. And for me, the most important example of this is is Black Lives Matter and the kind of spin-offs like the Kill the Bill movement in this country. Noam Chomsky has just said,
please, Alex.
that there's nothing comparable in American history to the Black Lives protests last year, which, let's remember, were protests involving both black and white people. These movements provide a context in which we can effectively mobilize against the Nazis, and in doing so, begin to create a situation in which we can mount a counter-offensive against capital and against the system that breeds the fascists and the far right in the first place. Okay, stopping there. Thanks.